And we are back. In chapter 2, the question was, where is Nate? And we do know that Nate sent the children ahead of him, his son and his daughter, his future daughter in law. So he was setting up some type of trick because they were being hunted by a grizzly bear. They were able to get Scott Kendall to Winona. Winona is now has her work cut out for her. Let's just say it like that. And she is trying to make certain that Scott Kendall is not going to die. So they're still trying to find out where is Nate. Well, Nate is still out there in the wilderness and he is still trying to get the bear to leave him alone. But the family is now at the cabin. So we are at chapter 3, and now the question is, what really brought Scott Kendall to Nate King's cabin um, to visit with his family? He brought himself to the gates of death because he took a nasty, nasty fall. Without further ado, we will continue with chapter 3. And we are reading, for those who are following along, The Quest by David Thompson. Again, chapter 1 was Who is the Rider on the Horse? Chapter 2, Where is Nate? And now we're on chapter 3. So we're trying to find out why Scott Kendall bringing himself to almost the gates of death, trying to get to Nate King. The furious Silvertip caught Nate King by surprise, thinking was about to give up. Nate was caught off guard when it suddenly renewed its pursuit, charging the bay in a burst of bestial rage. He slapped his legs and lashed the reins, but he was a shade too slow. The bay squealed in agony as claws that could pulverize bone sliced into its flank. And then they were in the clear, racing madly westward, with the grizz virtually breathing down Nate's neck. The bear was persistent beyond belief, more so than any Nate had ever come across. It wouldn't relent. For minutes on end, the chase continued. Again and again, the brute swung but missed. They shot out of the trees into the meadow, and Nate gave the bay its head. On open ground, the horse had an edge. With nerve-wracking slowness, they began to pull ahead. Nate looked back on hearing the grizzly roar in frustration. Exerting itself to its limit, the beast was able to maintain the pace for another 100 yards. Finally, though, it exhausted its store of stamina. The thudding paws slowed. The bear uttered several last irate growls as it came to a halt. And if looks could kill, the blazing hatred in its eyes would reduce Nate and the bay to charred cinders. Nate didn't slow down until he had gone another quarter of a mile. Enough powder was left in the powder horn to reload one of his pistols. He did so while watching to see what the bear would do next. Should it venture deeper into the valley, he would kill it. He'd have no choice. It posed too dire a threat to his family. For the longest while, the Grizz just stood there, sides heaving, head hung low. When it recovered, it turned to the left into the valley and Nate tensed. But it walked only a few dozen feet, raised its head to sniff the air, then pivoted and shambled to the south. Nate relaxed at last. Wiping his forehead with a sleeve, he headed home. The bay was tired, but Nate held it to a trot out of concern for Scott Kendall. True friends like Kendall were as rare as white buffalo and should be valued all the more because of their rarity. The few Nate had, he would do anything for, and they for him. But back in the States, it was different. There, people tended to take their friends for granted. They got together once or twice a week for ale and rum and at a local tavern or maybe a night on the town. The whole basis for their friendship was to have fun, to amuse themselves at idle diversions. Consequently, their friendships were often as shallow as their pastimes. A man might boast, "Oh, I have tons of friends," when in that ton, there wasn't one who would stand by his side when his life was at risk. In the wilderness, where day to day life was fraught with menace, the quality of man's friends was of paramount importance. A man had to know they would stick by him, come what may. When blood crazed Indians were closing in, there wasn't time to find out if someone had the backbone of a snail. In the wilderness, friends depended on one another to an extraordinary degree. They had to. And in doing so, they grew closer, becoming more like brothers, forging a bond so strong each would do anything for the other. Nate would rather have a handful of friends than a ton of casual acquaintances masquerading as the real article. Real gold was always preferable to fool's gold. Smoke was rising from the cabin's chimney when at the corral. The wound the bay had suffered wasn't deep and would keep a while. He'd get to it as soon as he checked on Kendall. Hurrying around the corner, he saw his son emerge with a bucket in hand. "How's Scott?" Zach was on his second trip to the lake. "Pa!" he exclaimed, glad to see his father unharmed. "You shook the grizz." "It took some doing," Nate said. "Mr. Kendall is in a bad way. He had convulsions a while ago, but Ma got him quiet down. Now she's boiling water and wants more. Then go, then off you go." Nate stepped indoors and was immediately hit by the heat wave. Evelyn was adding a log to the crackling fire. His wife was beside the bed, applying a damp cloth to Kendall's flushed face. "How bad is he?" "Husband." Winona was overjoyed, but she didn't rush into his arms as other women would have done. Her expression conveyed the depth of love as eloquently as any hug. "I've gotten some herbs into him, but if he lasts another day, it will be what you whites call a miracle." From the fireplace rose a shriek of pure delight. "Pa, you're all right." Evelyn flew at her father and leaped into his arms, squeezing him in glee. "Zach and Lou told us about the bear." "Where's Louisa?" Winona looked up. "I sent her after some yellow flowers that help reduce fever. She will not be back for a while yet." "What can I do?" Nate offered. "Help me get Scott's buckskins and moccasins off." Then we need to bathe him often to keep his temperature down. For the next half an hour, Nate was so busy he gave little thought to the question uppermost in his mind. Zach returned, filled the sink, and went for a third bucketful, Evelyn tagging along. All that could be done for their friend had been done, and as Nate wrung out the cloth, Winona stretched and gave voice to what puzzled him the most. Why did Scott try to come over the South Ridge? He knows how treacherous it is. What could he have been thinking? He had to be in a great hurry to reach us, so great he figured the risk was worth it, was the only conclusion Nate could come to. Which has me worried, husband. There's only one reason he would be so reckless. Scott is not the kind to take needless chances. No, he isn't, Nate mused and realized what he had to do. As soon as Lou gets back, I'm leaving for the Kendall place to check on Lisa and Val Marie. Will you be all right here while I'm gone? Winona gave him a quizzical look. Need you ask? Nate chuckled. Indian women in general, and his wife in particular, never needed coddling. They were as self reliant as any man and resented being treated as inferior. His wife had made that plain shortly after their marriage began. For the first few weeks, he had pampered Winona silly, acting as if she were the Queen of Sheba. Then, one evening, after supper, she had reached along across the table, clasped his hand in hers, and bluntly asked, Why do you treat me like a child, my husband? Nate had been so shocked. He sat there speechless. You insist on going everywhere with me. You won't let me ride alone. You even guard me when I go to the lake. In the cabin, you always hover over me, like a sparrow over its young. You are always underfoot, doing things when I have not asked you. If I lick my lips, you bring me a glass of water. If I comment I am hungry, you leap to bring me food. Why do you do all of this? I love you, Nate had blurted. And I love you, but this is not love, this is smothering. You upset me, husband, by not letting me do things on my own. I'm a grown woman. I can take care of myself, and I take great pride in being able to do so and not being a burden on you. Do you understand? At the time, Nate hadn't, but he had mumbled that he did, and from then on, he tried his best not to smother her. At length, he came to see what she meant and admired her all the more for being self sufficient. It was a source of unending pride that so independent a woman had chosen to give her heart to him because she rated him worthy of her affection. So now, giving Winona a kiss on the cheek, Nate walked to the cupboard and took down a tin filled with food and another cram with jerked venison. He filled a bag with enough to last a week, then filled his powder horn from the keg of black powder in the far corner. What can be keeping Lou? Winona asked. It should not take her this long. Maybe she had trouble finding the flowers you needed. I told her right where they are. It must be something else. If you're just tuning in, we are reading The Quest by David Thompson. They have been taking care of Scott Kendall, who wrote in really, really fast, and it's being considered reckless the way he um, went about it. And, anyways, now his life is in their hands. And Nate King is so grateful for such a friend that he feels it necessary to try and make certain that Scott makes it through this ordeal. And now he's in the process of going to check on Scott's family. And in the meantime, his future daughter in law, is out picking flowers so that Winona, her future mother in law, can see about Scott and make certain that he does not die, right? But she's noticing that it's taking Lou a little too long to get back with what she's requested. It's taking her a little too long. So now she's saying, I told her right where they are. It must be something else. And now we'll pick right back up. Louisa May Clark had found the hill easily enough, as well as the rocky area beyond where the yellow flowers grew. She dismounted and moved briskly from plant to plant, pulling them out of out by the roots. Winona had said a dozen would suffice, but Lou decided to pluck an extra 8 or 9 to be sure. Scrappy, scrappy little devils, they resisted being uprooted, and she was caked with perspiration before she was half done. Being in love made Lou giddy. She hadn't foreseen how glorious it was, how deliriously grand. Her mother and father had been in love, but in their latter years they spent so much time bickering it was a wonder they shared the same roof. Lou's marriage wasn't going to turn out like theirs did. In 20 years, Zach and she would still be just as much in love as they were at that very moment. They wouldn't fight, they'd never squabble, they would get along as a married couple should in perfect harmony. The ring of a hoof on stone shifted Lou's attention toward the mare, an impatient critter. It didn't much like waiting under a blistering sun for her to finish. Hold your horses, she said and giggled, telling a horse to hold his horses. Too bad Zach wasn't there to hear her. He'd have a merry laugh. Rising, Lou went to the next plant. She hunkered, gripped, she hunkered, gripped the bottom of the stem, and prepared to bring it up. The mare stomped again, nickering. You don't listen worth beans, do you? Lou remarked. It was staring at her in a most peculiar fashion. Behave or you won't get any oats tonight. The grain was hard to come by and a rare treat. Lou firmed her hold and was starting to uncoil when it occurred to her that the mare wasn't staring at her, but past her. She glanced over a shoulder and felt her insides churn. Winding down a slope to the west was a line of 7 riders, and while they were too far away for her to identify. Something in how they rode told her they were Indians. Lou forgot about gathering more plants. Scooping up those she had already collected, she ran to the mirror and stuffed them into a saddlebag. The war party, if that is what what it was, had several hundred yards to cover before it reached the hill. She would be well on her way to the cabin to alert the Kings. Swinging up, Lou reined the sorrel around. She had gone only several yards when she stopped in consternation. Approaching from the southwest were 7 more warriors. They had spotted her and were spreading out to cut her off her escape. Not if I can help it, Lou said grimly. She was not going to let the Kings be taken by surprise. When her father was slain, she'd had to stand by and do nothing. She would be doggone if she would fail her new family as she had failed them. Hee haw! Lou jabbed her heels and fled, heading due east to swing wide on the bunch to the south. But no sooner did she break into a gallop than they did likewise, paralleling her, evidently intent on cutting her off. They must know where the cabin is, she deduced, with growing dread. To make matters worse, the warriors to the west had also given chase. Her only other recourse was to head north, but that would take her farther from the Kings. Lou hunched forward in case the hostiles weren't of a mind to take her alive. They had bows and lances, and the leader had a rifle. She assumed he was the leader anyway, since he was in front of the rest and she had seen him gesturing at the others as if giving orders. The mare was game but tired. In the few past hours, it had been ridden at breakneck speed from the cabin to the ridge where Kendall had his mishap, then been ridden almost as fast back to the cabin, from there to the hill where the flowers grew. Now, when Lou needed it most, it was flagging. Do you reckon something happened to her, Paul? Nate King found his son's anxiety amusing. Louisa's absence could could be explained by any number of ordinary events. Everything from the mare throwing a shoe to Lou confusing Winona's directions and not being able to find the flowers. Zach rose in the stirrups to scour the terrain ahead. I get so worried about her sometimes it hurts. Do you ever feel that way when Ma is in trouble? Odds are Lou is just fine, son, Nate stressed. But yes, I've fretted about your mom something awful on occasion. It can't be helped. Not when you care for someone as much as we care for them. I I wish Lou had waited for me to get back, Zach complained. I should have gone with her. She has no business going around alone. Nate opened his mouth to relate his own dealings with Winona, but changed his mind. Some lessons had to be learned through personal experience. Louisa had a lot of spunk. She would put Zachary in his place eventually, all on her own. I never knew it would be like this. What would? Zach replied in a whisper. Love. It isn't what you expected? Blazes, Pa. Not at all. When I'm around Lou, it's like I'm not me. If that makes any sense. My thoughts get all jumbled. It's worse when she touches me. My mind goes as blank as a slate. Zach gnawed on his lower lip. When we're apart, she's all I think about. I worry every minute, like now. He stared hard at Nate. What in tarnations is wrong with me? Nothing. You're as normal as the rest of us. Is this what it's like for you? When you met Mom? It's it's still like that, Nate confessed. Only I don't let it affect me as much. I don't see how. I always thought that when I met the woman of my dreams, I'd go around as happy as a lark. Now I spend half my time feeling sickly. What do they call that? Love. Zach blinked, then laughed, and Nate couldn't help but join in. It had been months since they had had a father son talk, which bothered Nate some until Zach turned 12. They had talks like this all the time, but when Zachary became a teenager, he no longer seemed to value Nate's opinion of anything. Louisa shared the view. She held off firing out of fear that killing one of her pursuers would incite, the rest to do her in. Now she couldn't wait any longer. Extending the Hawken, she fired at the warrior's stout chest. It should have blown a hole in him the size of a melon. But a fraction of a second before the sizzling lead and spewing smoke belched from the muzzle, the man performed an astounding trick. He dropped onto the far side of his mount, hanging by a crooked elbow and a bent knee. The shot missed, and the warrior, unharmed, rose up onto the pinto's back. Lou clawed at a pistol. It was sliding clear when a bronze hand fell on her wrist. Twisting, she was nose to nose with the smirking warrior. Let go of me, Lou railed. She had lost her rifle and one of her pistols, and the second flintlock was pinned underneath her. But the butcher knife strapped to her side was still there. Whipping it out, she resolved to sell her life dearly. The warrior was grinning, or as Lou believed, leering at her, which fueled her anger. She thrust at his chest, only to have her wrist snared. Again, the warrior addressed her urgently, excitedly. Was it her final warning? Lou punched at his nose, striking his cheek when he jerked aside. With a powerful heave, the man flung her onto her back and straddled her, pinning her arms and shoulders. Lou bucked upward, but he was too heavy. Bitter tears formed as she sought to throw him off any way she could. That was when hooves thundered, and Lou figured the other Indians had arrived. But flying toward her was the one person she cherished above all things. Zach! She cried. Zach King was beside himself, boiling like a cauldron, overcome by a burning need to rip, to rend, to slay the warrior who had dared threaten his woman. He snapped his rifle, but the angle was wrong. He might hit Louisa. Reversing his grip, he held it poised to club and smash. The weight of Louisa lifted. The Indian had risen and faced Zack, his arms at his sides, making no effort to defend himself. His significance was lost on her. You're about to meet your maker, she gloated. A dark hand was raised, but not to employ a weapon. The warrior held it palm out, and that's the universal sign of a friendly greeting. Louisa rose onto her elbows, bewildered. What was the Indian trying to pull? He was smiling at Zack, even though the Hawken, which is a gun, was still upraised to bash his brains out. It had to be a trick, she told herself. Then behind Zack, Nate King appeared, riding as if his life depended on it. Nate was focused on his son, not on the Indian. Lou's intuition flared. Pushing onto her knees, she saw that the rest of the warriors had stopped to observe the outcome. Her name was yelled by Nate. The rest of what he the rest of what he said drowned out by the hammering din. Nate pointed at the stocky warrior, then at her. Lou could never say what made her do what she did next. A hunch, instinct. She sprang to her feet and leaped in front of the warrior, heartbeats before Zack reached them. Elevating her arms, she screamed, No! No, I'm not hurt. Don't do it. But he didn't hear her. Sunlight bathed the smooth stalk of the hawking as it arced toward her skull. And that brings us to the end of chapter 3.